First to Jason Israel, former Pentagon advisor. Jason Israel, thank you for your time. Now, there's been a lot of interesting topics in the international space, in particular between the Putin and Erdogan meeting.
Yes, absolutely, Annalise. And just a couple hours ago, it hit midnight in Syria, and that was supposed to be the time when this new ceasefire went into effect. Putin and Erdogan just met in Moscow yesterday in a 6-hour meeting, and they determined at the end of it that there would be a ceasefire and decided to open a sort of humanitarian corridor to allow some of the 1 million refugees that are on the Turkish-Syria border to be able to return home. So this is a big step in prospect for peace. Of course, there are a lot of questions as to whether or not this can maintain in place. There were apparently rockets fired and airstrikes even hours before the ceasefire was meant to go into effect, where several civilians were killed. And just remember, numbers-wise, Syria, used to have a population comparable to Australia, around 24 million, and now at about 18 or 19 million because of 5 million refugees. So that's a really big question when it comes to whether these people will be able to return home.
One of the other topics that's been really interesting on a global scale has been Afghanistan's election. What kind of impact has that had on their relationship with the United States?
Right. So, it was all the way back in September that the Afghanistan population came in to vote for its election, and here we are several months later with the results just coming out in the last couple of weeks. The current president, Ashraf Ghani, apparently won even after a recount, but Abdullah, the former chief executive who lost, has already claimed that he is the rightful president because he believes that the results of the election were inaccurate. So what you're seeing just this week, in a critical week for the U.S.-Taliban peace deal that we talked about last week, you're actually seeing a parallel government within Afghanistan form, and the current president of Afghanistan actually stating that he is not necessarily going to abide by the prisoner swap that the Taliban and the U.S. agreed on last week of 5,000 Taliban members going back to the Taliban. So a really critical week to see what will happen with the Afghan election and whether or not there'll be a clear path forward for the presidency, but also whether that U.S.-Taliban peace deal will hold, especially considering that there was continued violence in Afghanistan this week. A lot to look out for each week on this.
Absolutely, and there's a chance it could escalate in the coming months and really impact President Trump and his re-election chances.
Yes, in fact, I believe there is a stipulation in there for 5,000 U.S. troops to return home, and then all of them to return home within the next 14 months if the Taliban holds up its end of the deal. So it could have a big impact on how the president will view that withdrawal of troops.
And if I could ask about the South China Sea as well, it's been interesting to see what the potential impact of the coronavirus could be if that is going to force the Chinese to withdraw from the South China Sea. But it seems like there is still a bit of tension with a laser pointer being pointed at US troops.
Yes, absolutely. I think this week with a Chinese ship having pointed a high-power laser at a U.S. Navy plane, which can actually blind the pilots, being yet another example in this gray space that China is operating in between peace and conflict in the South China Sea. I found it very interesting that the U.S. Navy used Instagram actually as its tool of diplomacy, and anybody can look up the U.S. Navy Instagram account and see that the U.S. Navy posted about this and stated, "You don't want to play laser tag with us." That was the comment. But also with a rather formal list of what violations China had. So we'll see in the coming weeks if, as you mentioned, the coronavirus or other effects would have on China having to withdraw. But right now, they're very happy, it seems, to have this strategy of just sort of operating with these actions that are just below conflict, but are definitely trying to show that they still don't want any other countries operating in the region.
My goodness, God help us all if we're doing diplomacy by Instagram. Jason Israel, former Pentagon advisor, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.